Jake had always been a dreamer, but his dreams had grown stale over the years. Life in his small Midwestern town felt like a loop he couldn't escape. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. The relationships he'd tried to build never seemed to last, and the older he got, the more he wondered if he was destined to live a life of quiet monotony. It wasn't that he hated his life, it was just that he couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more. More excitement, more meaning, more connection. The idea of leaving the United States had been simmering in the back of his mind for years. But it wasn't until he stumbled upon a travel blog about the Philippines that the idea took root. The pictures were breathtaking crystal clear waters, lush jungles, and smiles that seemed to radiate warmth even through the screen. The more he read, the more he became convinced that this was where he needed to be. The cost of living was low, the people were known for their hospitality, and the culture seemed so different from anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about escaping, it was about finding something new, something real. The decision to move wasn't made lightly. Jake spent months researching, saving money, and planning every detail. He sold most of his belongings, quit his job, and said goodbye to the few friends and family members who still lived nearby. There were moments of doubt, of course. What if he couldn't adapt? What if he ran out of money? What if he was just running away from his problems instead of facing them? But the pull of the unknown was stronger than the fear. He told himself that even if it didn't work out, at least he would have tried. When he finally stepped off the plane in Cebu, the heat hit him like a wall. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the humidity, the smells, the noise. The airport was chaotic, with people shouting in a language he didn't understand and motorcycles weaving through traffic like they had a death wish. Jake had expected some culture shock, but he hadn't expected to feel so out of place so quickly. He reminded himself that this was part of the adventure, that he had chosen this, but the doubt crept in anyway. The first few weeks were a blur of adjustments. He found a small apartment in the city, but even that simple task was more complicated than he'd anticipated. The landlord spoke English, but the terms of the lease were confusing, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being taken advantage of because he was a foreigner. The cost of living was lower than in the U.S., but not as low as he'd hoped. He quickly realized that his savings wouldn't last as long as he'd planned, and the pressure to figure out a way to make money started to weigh on him. The language barrier was another challenge. While many Filipinos spoke English, Jake found that his American accent and fast speech often led to misunderstandings. Simple tasks, like ordering food or asking for directions, became frustrating exercises in patience. He tried to learn a few phrases in Tagalog, but the words felt awkward in his mouth, and he often got them wrong. The locals were kind and patient, but he couldn't help feeling like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The loneliness was the hardest part. Back home, Jake had always been something of a loner, but he'd never felt truly alone. Here, he was surrounded by people, but he didn't know how to connect with them. He tried going to bars and cafes, hoping to strike up conversations, but the cultural differences made it difficult. He didn't understand the humor, the references, the unspoken rules of social interaction. He missed the easy camaraderie he'd had with his friends back home, the shared history and understanding that made communication effortless. There were moments when he questioned his decision. Was this really what he wanted? Was he cut out for this kind of life? He had come to the Philippines looking for something, but he wasn't even sure what that something was anymore. The initial excitement had worn off, replaced by a gnawing sense of uncertainty. He knew he couldn't give up, not yet, but he also didn't know how to move forward. And then there was the dating scene. Jake had heard that Filipino women were kind, family-oriented, and loyal qualities he admired, but hadn't found in his relationships back home. He'd even entertained the idea of finding love here, but the reality was more complicated than he'd imagined. The few women he met seemed interested in him, but he couldn't tell if it was genuine or if they were just drawn to the idea of being with an American. He didn't want to be someone's ticket to a better life. He wanted a real connection. But how could he build that when he was still struggling to understand the culture himself? As the weeks turned into months, Jake began to realize that this journey wasn't just about finding a new place to live or even a new relationship. It was about finding himself. He had come to the Philippines looking for an escape, but what he really needed was a transformation. The challenges he faced were forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd ignored for years: his fears, his insecurities, his assumptions about the world. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he wanted to give up, but deep down, he knew he couldn't go back to the life he'd left behind. The question was, could he find a way to move forward? Could he learn to adapt, to embrace the differences instead of fighting them? And if he did, what would he become? The turning point came unexpectedly, as such moments often do. Jake had been wandering through a local market, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of frustration that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The market was a sensory overload, bright colors, the smell of grilled meat and fresh fruit, the sound of vendors calling out to potential customers in a mix of Tagalog and English. He was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, you look lost. Need some help?" Jake turned to see a man around his age with a friendly smile and an easygoing demeanor. His name was Marco, and as it turned out, he was a local who had spent a few years living in the US before returning to the Philippines. Marco seemed to sense Jake's unease and offered to show him around. That simple act of kindness was the lifeline Jake had been searching for. Marco became more than just a guide, he became a friend. He introduced Jake to the rhythms of life in the Philippines, teaching him how to navigate the complexities of the culture with patience and humor. Through Marco, Jake began to see the country in a new light. He learned that the chaos he had initially found overwhelming was just a different kind of order, one that required flexibility and an open mind. One of the first things Marco taught Jake was the importance of family in Filipino culture. It wasn't just about immediate relatives. It was about extended family, neighbors, and even close friends. Family was the foundation of everything, and it was expected that you would prioritize their needs above your own. This was a stark contrast to the individualism Jake had grown up with in the US, where independence was often valued above all else. At first, he found it suffocating, but over time, he began to appreciate the sense of community it created. Marco also helped Jake understand the nuances of dating in the Philippines. He explained that relationships here were often more traditional, with a focus on long-term commitment rather than casual dating. Family approval was crucial, and it wasn't uncommon for couples to involve their parents in major decisions. Jake realized that his previous attempts at dating had failed because he hadn't fully grasped these cultural expectations. He had been approaching relationships the way he would in the US. But here, it was a different game entirely. With Marco's encouragement, Jake decided to give it another try. He met a woman named Maria through a mutual friend, and from the start, he made an effort to do things differently. He took the time to get to know her family, even though it felt awkward at first. He learned to appreciate the slower pace of courtship, where small gestures and consistent effort mattered more than grand romantic gestures. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when he felt out of his depth, but he was determined to make it work. As Jake began to adapt to his new life, he also discovered new ways to support himself financially. He started teaching English online, which not only provided a steady income but also gave him a sense of purpose. He found that he enjoyed helping others learn, and it was a way to stay connected to his roots while embracing his new environment. He also learned to be more mindful of his spending, finding creative ways to stretch his budget without sacrificing the quality of his life. But the biggest change was within Jake himself. Living in the Philippines had forced him to confront his own assumptions and biases. He realized how much he had taken for granted in the US, from the convenience of modern infrastructure to the privilege of being a native English speaker. He also began to see the value in slowing down and appreciating the present moment, something that had always been a struggle for him. There were still challenges, of course. Jake missed the familiarity of home, and there were days when the cultural differences felt insurmountable. But he had learned to approach these challenges with curiosity rather than frustration. He no longer saw himself as an outsider trying to fit in. Instead, he was a student, eager to learn and grow. By the end of his first year in the Philippines, Jake felt like a different person. He had built a life for himself, one that was far from perfect but deeply fulfilling. He had found a sense of belonging, not just in a place but within himself. He had learned that happiness wasn't about escaping your problems, but about facing them head-on and finding meaning in the struggle. As he looked back on his journey, Jake couldn't help but wonder, what would his life have been like if he had stayed in the US? Would he have ever found the courage to confront his fears and insecurities? Would he have discovered the strength to adapt and grow? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He was exactly where he needed to be. Jake's relationship with Maria deepened over time, but it wasn't without its challenges. The cultural differences that had once fascinated him now became points of tension. Maria's family played a significant role in her life, and Jake often felt like he was dating not just her but her entire clan. Family gatherings were frequent, and he was expected to attend, even when he would have preferred some quiet time alone. He struggled with the lack of privacy and the constant need to be on, always polite, always engaged. There were moments when he questioned whether he could truly adapt to this way of life. Back in the US, Relationships had been more about independence, about two people coming together while still maintaining their individual identities. Here, it felt like merging into a collective, and Jake wasn't sure he was ready for that. He loved Maria, but he also loved his freedom, and the two seemed to be at odds. One evening, after a particularly long family dinner where he had felt like an outsider despite everyone's best efforts to include him, Jake confronted Maria. He told her how he felt, how he was struggling to balance his need for independence with her family's expectations. To his surprise, Maria listened without judgment. She explained that this was just how things were in her culture, that family was everything, and that if he wanted to be with her, he would have to find a way to make peace with it. Her honesty was a wake-up call for Jake. He realized that if he wanted this relationship to work, he would have to meet her halfway. It wasn't about giving up who he was, but about expanding his understanding of what a relationship could be. He started making more of an effort to connect with her family, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. He asked questions, learned about their traditions, and even tried his hand at cooking some local dishes. Slowly but surely, he began to feel like less of an outsider, and more like part of the group. But the challenges didn't stop there. Jake also had to navigate the financial dynamics of their relationship. In the Philippines, it was common for men to be the primary providers, and while Maria had her own job, there was an unspoken expectation that Jake would contribute more. This was a stark contrast to the egalitarian relationships he was used to in the US, where splitting bills and sharing responsibilities was the norm. At first, he resented the pressure, feeling like it was unfair, but over time, he came to see it as an opportunity to step up, to show Maria that he was serious about their future together. As Jake and Maria grew closer, they began to talk about the future. Maria wanted to get married and start a family, but Jake wasn't sure he was ready. The idea of settling down in the Philippines, of building a life so far from everything he had ever known, was both exciting and terrifying. He loved Maria, but he also loved the idea of keeping his options open, of being free to explore other possibilities. The tension came to a head one night when Maria asked him point blank if he saw a future with her. Jake hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, he saw the hurt in her eyes. She told him that she couldn't wait forever, that she needed someone who was all in. Jake knew she was right, but he also knew that he couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The conversation left them both shaken. For days, they avoided the topic, tiptoeing around each other like strangers. Jake felt torn, caught between his love for Maria and his fear of commitment. He knew he had to make a decision, but every time he tried to think it through, his mind went in circles. Finally, he decided to seek advice from Marco. Over a bottle of San Miguel beer, Jake poured out his heart, explaining his fears and doubts. Marco listened quietly, then asked a simple question. "What are you so afraid of?" Jake didn't have an answer, at least not right away. But as he thought about it, he realized that his fear wasn't really about Maria or the Philippines. It was about losing himself, about giving up the life he had always known for something uncertain. But then he thought about all the ways he had already changed, all the ways he had grown since coming to the Philippines. He wasn't the same person he had been when he arrived, and maybe that was a good thing. The next day, Jake went to see Maria. He told her that he was ready to take the next step, that he wanted to build a life with her, even if it meant letting go of some of his old ways. Maria smiled, and in that moment, Jake knew he had made the right choice. But the journey was far from over. As they began to plan their future together, Jake realized that there would always be challenges, always be differences to navigate. The key was to face them together, with patience, understanding, and a willingness to grow. As he looked out at the sunset over the ocean, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The months that followed Jake's decision to commit to Maria were a whirlwind of change and adjustment. They began planning their wedding, a process that was far more complex than Jake had anticipated. In the Philippines, weddings weren't just about the couple. They were about the community. Maria's family had strong opinions about everything, from the venue to the guest list to the menu. Jake found himself caught in the middle, trying to balance his own preferences with the expectations of Maria's family. At first, he struggled with the lack of control. Back in the US, he would have had a say in every detail, but here, it felt like his role was to nod and smile while others made the decisions. He tried to remind himself that this was part of the culture, that family involvement was a sign of love and support, but there were moments when he felt like an outsider in his own wedding planning. Maria, sensing his frustration, took him aside one evening and explained that this was her way of honoring her family. of showing them that their opinions mattered. She asked him to trust her, to trust the process, and to remember that this was just as much about them as it was about the two of them. Her words helped Jake put things in perspective, and he began to approach the planning with a more open mind. The wedding itself was a beautiful, chaotic affair. It was held in a small church in Maria's hometown, with hundreds of guests in attendance. Jake had never seen so many people at a wedding before, and he was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. But as he stood at the altar, looking into Maria's eyes, he felt a sense of peace. This was his life now, and he was ready to embrace it. After the wedding, Jake and Maria moved into a small house near her family. It wasn't what Jake had imagined a more private space, just the two of them, but he understood that this was part of the deal. Living close to Maria's family meant that they were always around, dropping by unannounced, offering advice, and sometimes meddling in their affairs. Jake had to constantly remind himself that this was normal here, that it was a sign of love and care, but there were days when it felt suffocating. The biggest challenge, however, was adjusting to married life itself. Jake had always been independent, used to making decisions on his own and living life on his terms. Now everything was a joint effort, from finances to household chores to social obligations. He and Maria had different ways of doing things, and it took time for them to find a rhythm that worked for both of them. There were arguments, of course. Jake sometimes felt like Maria didn't understand his need for space, while Maria felt like Jake wasn't fully embracing their new life together. But through it all, they learned to communicate, to listen to each other, and to compromise. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. As the months turned into years, Jake began to feel more settled. He had built a life for himself in the Philippines, one that was far from perfect but deeply fulfilling. He had a wife who loved him, a family that accepted him, and a community that welcomed him. He had learned to navigate the complexities of a culture that was so different from his own, and in doing so, he had discovered new strengths within himself. But there were still moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he had made the right choice. He missed the familiarity of life in the U.S., the ease of being surrounded by people who shared his language and his values. There were times when he felt like he would never fully belong, no matter how hard he tried. One day, as he was walking along the beach near their home, Jake found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought about all the challenges he had faced, all the ways he had grown, and all the sacrifices he had made. He realized that life was never going to be perfect, no matter where he was. What mattered was how he chose to face the challenges, how he chose to grow and adapt. As he watched the sun set over the ocean, Jake felt a sense of gratitude. He had come to the Philippines looking for something, and he had found more than he ever could have imagined. He had found love, family, and a sense of purpose. He had found a home. But the journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn, and Jake was ready for them. Life had settled into a rhythm for Jake and Maria, but it was a rhythm that still required constant tuning. The birth of their first child, a daughter they named Sophia, brought a new layer of complexity to their lives. Jake had always imagined fatherhood as a joyful, straightforward experience, but the reality was far more demanding. The sleepless nights, the endless crying, and the sheer responsibility of caring for a tiny human being left him feeling overwhelmed and, at times, inadequate. Maria's family stepped in immediately, offering help and advice at every turn. While Jake appreciated their support, he also felt like his role as a father was being overshadowed. He wanted to figure things out on his own, to bond with Sophia in his own way, but it seemed like there was always someone else in the room, offering a better way to hold her, feed her, or soothe her. The cultural expectation that families should be involved in every aspect of child-rearing clashed with Jake's desire for independence, and it created tension between him and Maria. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Jake snapped. He told Maria that he felt like he wasn't being given the space to be a father, that her family's constant involvement was making him feel like an outsider in his own home. Maria listened quietly, her expression a mix of hurt and frustration. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but firm. "This is how we do things here," she said. "Family helps. It's not about taking over. It's about sharing the load. You're not just a father, you're part of a family, and that means letting people in even when it's hard." Her words struck a chord with Jake. He realized that his resistance to her family's involvement wasn't just about wanting independence. It was about his own insecurities. He was afraid of failing, of not being good enough, and he was using his cultural differences as an excuse to keep people at arm's length. Over time, Jake began to let his guard down. He started to see Maria's family not as intruders but as allies, people who genuinely wanted to help him succeed. He learned to appreciate their wisdom and experience, even when it came in the form of unsolicited advice. And as he became more comfortable in his role as a father, he also began to feel more connected to the community around him. But the challenges didn't stop there. As Sofia grew older, Jake and Maria faced new decisions about her upbringing. Maria wanted to raise her in the traditional Filipino way, with a strong emphasis on family, faith, and respect for elders. Jake, on the other hand, wanted to instill in her the values he had grown up with: independence, critical thinking, and a sense of individuality. These differences led to heated discussions, but they also forced Jake and Maria to confront their own beliefs and priorities. They had to learn to compromise, to find a balance between their two cultures that would allow Sofia to thrive. It wasn't easy, but it brought them closer together, strengthening their partnership as they navigated the complexities of parenthood. As the years passed, Jake's life in the Philippines became more than just an experiment. It became his reality. He had built a career teaching English online, which allowed him to support his family, while still having the flexibility to spend time with Sofia. He had learned to navigate the intricacies of Filipino culture, not perfectly, but with enough grace to feel like he belonged. And he had found a sense of purpose in being a husband and father, in building a life that was rooted in love and commitment. But there were still moments when he felt like an outsider, when the cultural differences felt too vast to bridge. He missed the simplicity of life in the US, the ease of being surrounded by people who shared his language and his values. There were times when he wondered if he had made the right choice, if he had sacrificed too much of himself in the process of adapting to a new life. One day, as he was watching Sofia play with her cousins in the backyard, Jake found himself reflecting on his journey. He thought about all the challenges he had faced, all the ways he had grown, and all the sacrifices he had made. He realized that life was never going to be perfect, no matter where he was. What mattered was how he chose to face the challenges, how he chose to grow and adapt. As he watched Sofia laugh and run around, her face lit up with joy, Jake felt a sense of peace. He had come to the Philippines looking for something, and he had found more than he ever could have imagined. He had found love, family, and a sense of purpose. He had found a home. But the journey wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn, and Jake was ready for them.